Yeah, it works. Where it is, it works.
Yeah, that's good.
You sure?
Yeah, you just see some interesting lights behind my head, but that's okay.
They'll listen.
Listen, they don't have to get such a good view because they could come. You can't reward people for sitting in their pajamas eating popcorn, right? That's not the appropriate. Okay. So, I thought that there would be a great idea to look at Tehillim Parak Aleph. First chapter in Tehillim. First of all, the reason is because the central theme of it is talking about the tzaddik, the good person, the righteous person being like a tree. And so with Bshvat being about trees, so I want to, even before that, I want to just introduce something simple about Bshvat that Hirsch writes, which is tremendous and it can't be reviewed enough. And I'll give you my take on it, and we'll start with that, and then we'll learn a little bit of this parak, and there's 3 or 4 clear messages from the Svarim that I think are life-changing. So, Tu B'Shvat Higia, there's a song that is filled with falsehoods, because the song claims that there's Tziporim Berosh Kol Gag, right? And it's basically describing the spring is here. Now, Tu B'Shvat doesn't occur in the spring; it occurs in the dead of winter. Any place where there's actually winter, you will see broken trees, trees without their branches, trees without their leaves, trees that are storm battered. As Rav Hirsch says, in the spring and in the summer, they wear their crown proudly of all the leaves, and everything is there. And suddenly the winter comes, and the leaves all fall off, and they die, and the tree looks dead. And in the middle of that, we go out to the tree and say, "It's your birthday! Happy birthday to the trees!" And that's supposed to have some sort of meaning. How is that the birthday of trees? Right? Basic kasha, simple thing. You've heard this before. So says Rav Hirsch. He says, the success that will come in the spring of a human being's life. A lot of people will look at that and that external stuff, that beautiful tree, and they'll feel, hey, that's a nice tree. That's beautiful. That's what we want. And they don't understand that actually came from some sap moving inside the tree back in the winter when everything looked dead to any person on the outside. Internal work was happening. And the tree was staying alive and getting itself ready for the spring. And what you see growing in the spring is a product of what was happening in that winter when you said, what's wrong with this kid? How are they ever going to grow up? What's going to be with them? They're going through such a hard time in school and this and that. That's what was creating the person that you're going to see later. Just as a simple example, sometimes you have a guy shows up in yeshiva. Whatever kind of yeshiva it is, there's a version of this. I'll give you an example. There's a yeshiva I'm thinking of where it's kind of in the black hat world, but they generally deal with kids who, though they come from that kind of a family, didn't bring a hat with them to the yeshiva. Right? They're kind of, the kids are, okay. A lot of boys there get very inspired and want to be close to Hashem. So what happens when you want to be really inspired? I mean, you put on a hat and a jacket and exclusively white button-down shirts. Every yeshiva has its own version of this. So this yeshiva does not allow you to do that. You're not allowed to put a hat, unless you came with one. If you came with one and that's what you're always wearing, we're not going to stop you. But you're not allowed to make that change for the first year there. If afterwards you want to make the change, make the change. But you're not allowed. You know why? Because if you put on your black hat and your jacket, and that makes you think you're more religious than you were 2 minutes before you put it on, you're so out of it. That's distracting. That's damaging. You see, a truly religious experience cannot be seen by anyone else. If anyone else can see it, it's not religious. What does that mean? If you're davening Shemona Esrei, if you are or are not connecting to God, it's something that no one can see. It's between you and God. No one can know. Now, people can see if you're shuckling back and forth viciously, right? If you're clenching your fists, if you're pressing your sitter up against your nose, that people can see. And if that helps you pray inside, you should do those things. But it's only thing that matters is what's on the inside. The only thing. The stuff on the outside, it doesn't make any difference at all, unless it's influencing you on the inside. To the point that we say mitzvot tzrichot kavana. If you were to go sit in a sukkah on Sukkot, but you wouldn't have the intention that God instructed us to sit in the sukkah, you haven't done anything. It's not mitzvah. So it could be that we're not clear. Maybe there's an opinion that you still have done. It's a somewhat more complicated thing than that, but we definitely rule you have to do that, lest it not be considered a mitzvah. And the main point, welcome, the main point of any mitzvah, of any good deed, is an internal experience. There's the outside is only a way to facilitate something on the inside. For that reason, now it doesn't mean the outside is not important. It's extremely important to blow the shofar because of what, right? But these are primarily internal things. If someone else can see it, it's not it. That's not Yiddishkeit. And so the celebration of the tree's birthday is because a tree is similar to a person. Ki ha'adam eitz hasada, person's like a tree. So the aleph is, just like the tree, the great success that it has later is based upon internal work, based upon quiet, secret, internal realities. If you were to make the external of the tree look different, you take a beautiful group of artificial leaves and flowers and fruits, and you go out and festoon your tree. Yeah? I mean, you wouldn't really have a tree. It would be beautiful for a few minutes, and after a couple days, it would be evident to anybody, right? The wind would come, and that's not a tree. A tree is something that is alive on the inside, and even when broken, and even when going through difficult times, is rooted so that the sap is starting to move. And in life, we're supposed to realize the true growth that happens, the true greatness that happens, is not that boy when he's coming out of his yeshiva after a couple of years, and he looks the part, and everyone says, wow, that's a nice Ben Torah, that's a nice religious boy. That's an after-the-fact thing. Do you understand? In other words, that's what we're trained to do. Ah, what a wonderful person, because look at how they look on the outside. What we should be saying is, that's beautiful. What's happening is on the inside. In fact, anybody who knows anything about dealing with especially troubled teenagers will know that if you focus at all on the external, you destroy it. In other words, the yeshiva, since the real truth is that all important work happens internally, so it's really, it becomes extremely important not to focus on the externals and not to focus on and so you'll look at yeshivas where people are really growing and really doing internal work, right? I mean, places for kids who are struggling. And you could see kids without kippahs. And you could see kids who are definitely not dressed the part of what is a top yeshiva guy. And what those people are doing is the work, is the internal sap growing so that the tree becomes so strong and so healthy that when the spring does come eventually, this is like a really, really important attitude for us to have, both in judging other people and also like in our own journey. Like, it is not so important what things look like on the outside. It's really important how strong and connected things are on the inside. So that's one of the first lessons. So now listen to this. I want to just read. It's 6 psukim. It's not so much. I'm just going to read the psukim and translate them for a second so we have an idea of what we're looking at in chapter 1 of Tehillim. Ashrei ha'ish. Fortunate is the person. Fortunate. Asher lo halach b'atzat risha'im, who didn't walk following the advice of the wicked. U'v'derech chata'im lo amad, he didn't stand in the path of sinners. Uv'moshav leitzim lo yashav, and he didn't sit where cynical people sit. Instead, b'torat Hashem chesokim, all he desires is the teaching of Hashem, the instructions of Hashem. And he thinks about that every day and every night, yom v'layla, all the time. So that's the first 2 psukim. So fortunate is the person who is really focused on what God says is right, and not scornful people sitting on the street corners. V'haya, such a person ke'etz, will be like a tree. Shosul al palgei mayim, who is shatul, which means planted. We're going to get to this. There's another word, natua, which is planted. So what's the difference between shatul, and natua? We're going to get to that in a second because that's significant. Al palgei mayim, upon many brooks of water. Asher pirio yitin bi'ito. So this person, if you focus on the Torah instead of sort of everyone else, the scoffers and the jokers and the, right? Then here's what you'll be. You'll be like a tree that's rooted by brooks of water. Asher pirio yitain be'ito, that gives its fruit at just the right time. Ve'alehu lo yibol, and the branches don't wither. V'chol asher yaseh yatzliach, and anything this tree does, it succeeds at. Or maybe another possibility is that it's no longer talking about the tree. It'll be like a tree, and everything he does will succeed. Lo ken harishaim. However, the wicked are not like the righteous. They are not like a tree that's planted in a stable place. Kim kimots. They're going to be like chaff, like pieces of straw. But just asher tidefenu ruach, that the wind just moves to the side. So righteous people are like a tree, and wicked people are blown by the wind like chaff. So the lawless, the Rishonim, will not stand up in judgment, and the sinful will not have any part of the religious community, tzaddikim, the righteous community, because Hashem knows the way of the tzaddikim, the derech rishaim toved, and the way of the Russia, of the wicked people, toved, was going to get lost. It's going to be lost sort of on its own. That's like how the grammar works there. So we're going to get back to some of this. Okay, so the first thing is, let's look at this comparison. Just Pasha Pshat. Again, before we start seeing like some sources in the Gemara, the Rishonim, the righteous person is like a tree. They're rooted, they're stable. The wicked person is like chaff. They just blow with the wind. Whichever way the wind blows, that's where they go. So do you understand what this tells you about wicked people? About who's wicked? So you'll have somebody that calls himself a teacher of Torah. You have somebody that calls himself a rabbi or something, right? And the things they teach are antithetical. I don't know if the Exodus from Egypt ever happened, right? I don't know if the Torah really meant the things that it said. I don't know if God wrote this, right? And you have this. You have full movements like this. So you say, well, that's wicked. You say, wicked? He's a very sweet man. He's very kind. I met him once. He was very gentle and friendly. I saw him talking to a homeless person. You understand? So he's a nice man. Not a Russia. See, it doesn't say here that tzaddikim keep all the mitzvos, and Rishon running around, kick people in the shins, and then giggle and run away. That's not what it says, right? If that's what it said, then this guy's a tzaddik, not a Russian. When you have ideologies that are dangerous, there's many people who lived in communist Russia who were ideologues, who really meant well, and they're responsible for the lives and livelihoods of millions and millions and millions of people. The result of everything that they did was wicked, was evil. No, but come on, he was such a nice guy. So that's not it. We have this impression that as long as you're not really going over to an elderly woman and pushing her down a flight of stairs and stealing her purse, that you're a nice person, right? That's not how it goes. A person whose values are moved by the wind, whichever way the wind goes, then that's what he defines gender as, and that's what he defines truth as. So such a person is wicked, and they're dangerous. The Torah gives you it is the only way to give a person the capacity to be rooted in the truth. And whatever comes and whatever goes, and there is some branches will get knocked off here and there, because sometimes storms come, and you can't just blow with the wind. I mean, if you blow with the wind, you're a Russian. This is a really big idea. Because who else in the world has had consistent values ever? We're talking about if in the 1950s you would talk to Moshe Feinstein, Eli Gedolim, and today you would talk to any observant Jew, we're espousing the same values. Whereas when you have somebody running for president, right? 4 years later, after the first time they're running on a different platform. And don't tell me it's because I used to think marriage is only between a man and a woman. That's Obama's first term, right? And the second term, no, I think it's between any two adults. He didn't change his mind, really. The wind started blowing in a different direction, and now he believes something different. And he actually believes that that's a Russia. Now, I'm not saying one political party or the other. Any person, right? It's just an example of within one person's presidency to believe something so different. Yeah, all your neighbors also. All your neighbors. Everyone. That's the world. The Jewish people are supposed to be like this tree that is rooted in the Torah and seeks its nutrients from the Torah, and there is no budging it. There's no moving it. Yeah, but I think nowadays things are different. Okay, good. See how that works. See if there's going to be any Jews left. See if you have any grandchildren that are Jewish. If you say it about anything, If you say it ideologically about anything, it's a disaster. Well, it used to be that maybe that's the right way to keep the Torah, but now, I'm not saying you have to be perfect, right? Nobody's perfect. Don't bend the truth. Don't blow with the wind. I don't know. I don't feel like doing that mitzvah, and therefore, very dangerous. Very dangerous. That's the difference between tzaddik and rasha. Sticking to the truth and being rooted in the truth, even when it is unpopular, is okay. So that's an important point. Now, ke'etz shatul, a tree. This tree that we're all going to try to be like is going to be planted, and the word shasul, the Gemara says in Avodah Zarah, Masechet Avodah Zarah, it says, Nata, Rashi explains there, Nata is when you plant something for the first time. Shatul is when you took something that already existed and you moved it to somewhere more conducive for it to grow, to richer soil. So the Gemara says that it's important to learn Torah from multiple teachers. You should not learn Torah from only one person. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah says that a person who learns Torah from only one person, Rav Chizda said to his students, he said, I'm afraid to tell you this, because I think you'll all leave, right? But if you learn Torah from only one teacher, you don't see any real blessing in your life. So they all left, right? And then he explained to them, he says, well, it depends. When you're learning the basic text of the Mishnah, right, the basics of Torah, you should learn it from one person, because otherwise you'll find inconsistencies, because people have a different style of teaching. But once you know the basic texts, then you need to see what different great scholars say. The Maharal says, because every person has their own perspective, but it's only one perspective. To be able to have a hasaga koleles, a broader attitude towards the truth and towards Torah, you have to have more than one teacher in your lifetime. You have to see things more than one way. If you know anybody who has only learned in one place, they've only learned one kind of thing, they have only one attitude, even if it works for them, they can be very difficult people to relate to. They can be very difficult people to talk to. They'll have a hard time understanding you. They can often have a very hard time understanding their own children. Because you have a few kids, every human being, Rav Kook has this line where he says 2 different human beings are as different from one another as 2 different species in the animal kingdom. Any 2 human beings. People are really different. We're not like lab rats. You have identical twins with the same DNA. They're completely different people. And it's really important in terms of being able to navigate the world, to be able to understand the Torah for what it really is, to have more than one perspective within the authentic gamut of Torah. A person should learn from more than one person. So first of all, here's what this means. This means that you really have to keep things fresh in the way that you approach and understand the Torah. If the same attitudes, Purim's going to come. Purim means something to Jewish people. It's an important holiday. There's a message in 2022 to every one of us for Purim. Don't get stuck on some Dvar Torah you said 5 years ago, or one thing you once heard. This has to be something that's happening right now. Person sit down at the Pesach Seder and have their notebook of all the same stuff that they've been talking about the last 20 years. That's not okay. That can't happen. Meaning, a person has to be learning new things, learning new perspectives, seeing things from a different way. It's not only true. The word palgemayim, which the Mefarshim say is part of the reason the Gemara got to this. Palgemayim, which means brooks of water, is also from the word plugta, plag, which means a disagreement. Liflog. In the Gemara, that's a language in Aramaic. So it means, and you find it in Bereshit Sefer. The guy's name was Peleg because Misham Niflagu, right? It means to spread out in different directions, to argue and disagree.
Is that where the term plag mikvah comes from?
Yeah, it's the section. Yes, in other words, plag means like a portion. So plag gufa would be like a part of one spot, right? Like so plag because it comes from the word plukta, right? Disagreement. So it's different. Right, a diversion of ways. So the idea is like it's sort of brooks of water. They're all going different directions, and they're all scattered. That the appropriate way to soak up Torah is to appreciate multiple perspectives. I want to explain why that is. You see, It's not because every one of us is going to need a little bit of this and a little bit of that. That's not quite it. It's that as long as we believe there's only one thing, so then we've completely stifled creativity in the self. There's one way that we all must connect is just a totally false thing. It's not true. Every person has to figure out within their own self, how am I going to understand the Torah and the mitzvah? And it has to be true. It has to be within the Masorah. But within that context, we need to understand that there's room for you to be yourself and figure out how to do that. Not everybody understands that. If everyone must believe the following exact formulation of things, and there's no room for machloket and for different opinions, and so then just hearing two different people who you consider authentic, I've had this so many times, and you have it in the Svarim. You'll read two different things from authentic Svarim that are saying the opposite thing. Now, the truth is that they're not really the opposite, but they're different. They're completely different. One person is saying that it's so important for you to live in the land of Israel. And another Chacham is saying, that's totally not supposed to be on your radar right now. Here's how you say it, right? And they're both coming from a place of truth, and they're both authentic. And some of that. And now I have Torah. Right? That's not the point. The point is, if you can realize that two great rabbis, two authentic teachers of Torah, can have different perspectives, and yet they're both authentic, so then you are on a route to actually becoming somebody who can have their own connection, their own place. It's not just copying the neighbor or copying someone else. It's authentic to who you are. What's the oral Torah? That's just a human being. You need a human being. And that means derech eretz kabbalah Torah. You need a human being who's ethical, who's going to think straight, who's going to be reasonable. Right? If you have a person who's a terrible jerk and their midos are all crooked, so that'd be like writing the Torah on something that doesn't allow the letters to show. It's not. But a human being who's a human being can then have the Torah with them. You are an integral part of the Torah as you're supposed to live it. And therefore, depending upon your qualities and your abilities and your thoughts, the Torah is supposed to work together with you on those. One of the most basic things that I try to teach young people, that's important for all of us, but it's something that let me tell you what the Torah is. The Torah is a list and an explanation for all of us of how to be the happiest. The purpose of the Torah, all the mitzvahs, is to make you a more enriched and happy and good person. So, as an example, most of us can probably see why, even though Shabbat is a very demanding thing, if you keep Shabbat, it enriches your life. It makes your life better. It makes it deeper. It makes it more meaningful. Is that fair to say? If you've kept it, if you've even watched people keeping it, you can see. And even if it's just simple, I see why family time is nice, and I see why turning off your phone is nice, and I see why, right? All these different things, even if it's as simplistic as that, that's also a very sophisticated thing to realize. Well, that's the purpose of every single one of the mitzvahs. There's not one that isn't there to make, therefore, if a person says, I don't know if that mitzvah really speaks to me, they're bonkers. God said, this is the absolute best thing for you. So, again, are we always ready for every mitzvah? Are we not? Okay, everybody has to grow in a reasonable way. But they're completely off the wall. But the one reason why a person could misunderstand that is because they don't understand that the Torah is a prescription for you to actualize yourself in the happiest, most productive way, physically, spiritually, emotionally, through the Torah. That's what these mitzvot are. Torah Chaim, instructions for living. That's the whole point. Now, if we don't understand that, then we have a very warped relationship with Torah. Therefore, a person needs to be prepared to take their self and uproot. This is the way I've done it until now. But here's the richest soil for further growth. And therefore, I have to change my place. Now that's petrifying. Moving is very scary. We have good friends who, are just think about moving to the valley, right? And it's overwhelming. It's heartbreaking. They're crying. You go to, she's crying more than him, right? But I mean, the idea of moving from one place to the next is it's always hard. But you need to be nutrient rich. You need to make sure that, so therefore, learning Torah from more than one place, more than one source, is really meant, in my opinion, to teach you this idea that the purpose is not for you to imitate one specific form of success. It's for you to really understand who you are and succeed. And all you need to do is have a couple different people teach you Torah, which is authentic, for you to realize there's different ways, and there's different attitudes, and there's different methodologies within what's true. Find your own. As long as the person is stuck in one, they're often trying to stuff a square peg into a round hole. And that doesn't work, right? Okay. So. One more thing I would say from this Gemara also is that shasul as opposed to natua. Natua is when you're planted in one place, and shasul is when you can replant somewhere else. Besides for the importance of always having new infusions of inspiration, which is very, very key. Life gets boring for us. And everything, the most wonderful things in the world get boring. And we have to keep inspired. It's a big job in life to take responsibility to try to do that. But another thing that's really important is to be adaptable. Like, there's not too many people that have the exact life that they would have expected. Very few people in the world, if they could script it out, would be exactly where they are at this moment, with the exact challenges that they're facing. Which is just a good enough sign to never trust yourself. Because God knows everything, right? And He planned it this way. So this is what's best. So if that makes no sense to you, that's outstanding. Because it means you can now learn God knows better than you. And you should always trust Him. Because if right now you would never think this is what's best for you, and yet it is, so then what do we know? You understand? Like, what do we know? The thing is to be adaptable, to be willing to be replanted, to realize that the tzaddik is the person who's planted in the richest soil. He's willing. He's not going to stick to it. If I have to move to here, if I have to go to there, and that doesn't just mean to move from one house to the next, right? It means to adjust. I thought I would be in this line of work. I thought I would have this kind of a child or a friend. And that's not what I'm experiencing. That's not what I'm having. So guess what? Right? All the growth of the tzaddik is defined as being rooted, but also being adaptable to be rerouting with the two O's, somewhere else. To be able to now be planted. If it's richer soil, then that's where I have to be. I think that's also a really, really important lesson from this parak of Tehillim. And it could be it needs more attention. But there's one more thing that I want to focus on, because I think it's so important. So this is, what I have here is Pirush Tehillim of Rabbi Yosef Chayon. Rabbi Yosef Chayon, you never heard of, most likely. Not such a famous name at first. He was the rabbi in Lisbon, Portugal. He died in 1490. His students, two of his famous students were Abarbanel, was his student, and another one was Rabbi Yosef Yavitz. Rabbi Yosef Yavitz was also thrown out of Spain in 1492. He's often called the Chassid Yavitz. He wrote on Pirkei Avos, a very popular sefer to this day on Pirkei Avos, and he actually wrote a book about what it was like being thrown out of Spain. That's a fascinating, called Or Hashem, like an absolutely fascinating autobiography of what it was like, and who stayed religious and who didn't, and like very, very interesting, intimate portrait from a Gadol B'Torah who was alive at the time. So Rabbi Yosef Chayon has here a commentary on Tehillim. And there's a number of great things in the first chapter, but there's just one thing here I want to... Pasuk said, Hashem knows the way of the righteous, and the way of the wicked, toveid. So, Yodeya, Hashem knows, and is involved in, and paying attentive to, the ways of good people. And He sees to it that the ofen shetaseh v'tatzliach, He sees to it, a good person, the tzaddik, Hashem is involved. He sees to it they'll be successful at what they need to do. The derech risha'im behefech, The way of the wicked people is the opposite. Hihi me'atzma tovet. On their own, they are lost. It doesn't say ye'abed, that he destroys them. Al derech yodea, like the yod, like he knows. And he says, it just happens from the way they're living their lives, that it's not structured and it's not good and it destroys itself. So God is involved with the righteous person and is attentive to him. And the wicked person, because of his choices, just kind of ruins things for himself. That's what he says. Derech Rasha'im Tovet. It just is kind of lost. It's not God doing that directly and deliberately. You know, there's when someone's wicked in our community, in our world, there are recent stories in the news of people doing pretty wicked things, culminating in the wickedness of suicide. I mean, people doing really wicked things. So what's the attitude? So this is like something everybody somehow needs to talk about, right? It's important. And what do we say about this guy? So some people turn this into almost like rage. That person will be tearing apart and burning the person's books or something, right? That person. Which is kind of understandable. To be very upset. So I want to explain something really important and give you a few sources about that I think is really important. And it's a little bit of a side issue, but it's really important. So I spoke to somebody recently who said that he's a middle-aged man. He went to a therapist for some time, and this therapist would regularly say to him, "This is because of your mother, this is because of your father. Remember that thing you told me about your mother. I need you to write a letter to them that expresses your anger to them. What they did wrong, so forth." And this person basically said, "Over my dead body." He says, "My parents are already old." He says, "They really meant well. They're not bad people. Yes, there's some things that they did that were not correct." He says, "I have nothing but love and gratitude to them for everything they did for me." He says, "I would never write such a letter." And he eventually dropped the therapist because this person wouldn't let it go. The question is, who's right here, right? Like, who's right here? And I'll tell you where I think, from the story I was told, I don't know the name of the therapist, so I'm not even judging a person, but here's where this therapist, I think, went wrong. There is a beautiful Gemara that tells the story of Dama ben Messina. Dama ben Messina is a well-known Gentile from the city of Ashkelon because of the following two stories. One time his father was sleeping, and the rabbi showed up to purchase a jewel from him that they needed for the Kohen Gadol's clothing, and he would not wake his father up. He said, "No, I'm not waking him up." No matter to make millions of dollars, he wouldn't do it. And they wound up in the interim, before they were going to come back, they left. And he said, "Okay, we'll come back, or maybe we'll come back." I don't know if they promised to come back. On the way, they found someone else with it. So they were able to buy it from someone else. They didn't have to deal with him again. A year later, he had a red heifer born, a paraduma. They came to him, and they paid him basically the same amount of money he would have made from the first deal. So this was a great story. He honored his parents. There's another story. The Gemara then says, one time he was sitting among the elders of Rome. Dama ben Messina was sitting among the Gedolei Romi, wearing a sirkon shel zahav, I don't know, some golden clothing, something very fancy, right, dignified. And his mother came up to him and ripped off his clothes, just ripped it off of him, and spit in his face and smacked him upside the head. And he didn't do anything. He just sat nicely. Didn't do anything. That's the other thing. Now, the second story, for some reason, is not... It's really more impressive to me. And, right? It wasn't a voluntary thing. It was horrible. And it's funny because the first story, he was willing to sacrifice money. The second story, he was willing to sacrifice kavod, right? Dignity. So the question, apparently the money one speaks to more people. That's why the story is more well known, right? I guess. So the question is, how does somebody develop? We read this Gemara, and this is held up to us as a standard that we should achieve, right? We should try to get to this level of greatness, where even if somebody humiliates us in public, we don't respond. we don't respond to our mother, we don't, right? Like that kind of behavior is considered some sort of an ideal. Is that fair to say? The Gemara is saying that. So the problem is, how do you do it? Like, great, you're supposed to do that. How are you supposed to do that, right? So I heard this pointed out by Rabbi Kalish from Yeshiva in Waterbury. He said the following magnificent thing. He said, if you look at Tosas says, Yesh b'medrash. There is an opinion in the Midrash, Shahaita miturefet midaita, that his mother was completely crazy. There's such an opinion. Now, does that make it easier? Does that make it harder? Does everyone realize she's crazy? Did anyone realize she's crazy? None of that is clear. But Rabbi Kalish says that's what you're supposed to say to yourself whenever you're dealing with anyone else who has hurt you. You say to yourself, Yesh b'midrash, that this maybe, right? Maybe there's an opinion that this person's completely crazy. Just say to yourself, maybe they're completely crazy. What does that mean? My problem cannot be whether you are or are not a good person. When this fellow, when he was a young boy, had issues with the way his mother or father treated him, he is not willing to start saying my father and mother were bad people. The therapist needs him to say that. Right? Wants him to write a letter to that effect. That's a bad therapist. What he needs to say is, when my father did such and such, I felt lonely. I felt sad. Here's my story. Whether he's good or bad, he might be crazy. It's none of my business. Hashem is going to judge people. I'm not good at judging people. That's not my problem. I know what it meant to me, and that I have to deal with. So that, in the Sefer HaChinuch, Mitzvah Reish Mem Aleph, it says, Shalo linkom. The Torah says, don't take revenge. It says in the Sefer HaChinuch, why not? Somebody hurts you. They had no right to hurt you. So why is the Torah saying not to take revenge? He says, because when a person hurts another person, Hashem allowed that to happen. And two things are true. One is that the person did something wrong. They have free choice, and they will be punished or rewarded for their choices. A second thing is true, that God runs every single thing that happens in the world. And when King David was cursed by someone, he said, Hashem must have told him to curse me. Because he brings that example. Meaning, when something happens to you in life, there are two things that are true. One is, this is meant to happen to you. Second thing is, somebody used free choice and needs to be addressed. If you use all of your attention and focus on hating that person and plotting revenge for that person and being angry at that person, you will never address your own issues. You will never be able to deal with what happened to you. And therefore, it is irrelevant. This 7th grade teacher that I had was so terrible, and that's why I'm not religious. You meet people like this as adults that are still hung up on that person. And the answer is, I don't know about that person. And if they did something bad, maybe they're crazy. They are not in my story. My story is when that person did such and such, who I'm not even busy hating. I'm not even have the energy to spend my life festering hate for that person, because that would distract me totally. Here's how I felt, and here's what I need to work on because of the experience that I had. And the minute that a person gets to that place, everything changes. Hashem turns away. The wicked person is not a focus of Hashem's attention. So we're supposed to walk in his ways. Similar thing. It's just not a focus. Derech Hashem Toved. The wicked people ruin themselves. I cannot be spending my time and energy filling myself with hatred. There was an organization, which I don't hear so much about anymore, that was very busy going after, rightfully so. I have no real negative thing to say about the organization. I don't know much about it. But they were going after people who were hurting children and right? They were trying to take care of the community. And they would publicly out people, and they would have a website, and they, really, and like the one thing that was so consistent that you would feel is that we are trying to create villains and enemies and people to hate. It felt very strong like that to me, and that was always hard for me. I just don't think that's very healing. You are allowed to have negative feelings towards someone else. You're allowed to say, I don't like that person, I hate them, they're a Russia. But for that to become the focus, it is not cathartic, it's not helpful, and it actually distracts from the real work that you and I need to do in life to be the people we need to be. And therefore, yesh b'medrash, right? In other words, that attitude of like, I don't know, maybe the person was crazy. It's not my problem. They are not my focus. So therefore, I even feel when somebody is a terrible villain in our world, using attention and energy, let's get everybody together, and we'll all curse his name, and we'll all throw... They may deserve that. That's not going to help us. It's not going to help us. It's not going to alleviate any of the real pain that people have suffered. Again, it's important for us to be clear as a community. What's good? What's bad? Who gets respect? Who doesn't? Right? It's such a thing. I don't think it's appropriate to attend such a funeral, and I understand how we have to make certain statements as a community, but not to foster rage, because that's just not healthy for us. It's not how we process these things, and I think that this is really, really important with anyone else in the world. All you have is yourself. You understand? What happens, say for Hafenach is saying, when somebody does something bad to you, an Orthodox Jew sees the world like this. We see two things happening all the time. So when I say, Hashem sent me a wonderful wife, right? So I'm comfortable to say that that's a true statement. Now, you want to say, well, that's not true, because I know the name of the person who suggested that you guys go out, and her name is Chani. So you're telling me Hashem sent it, but it's not true. So that's no, I'm not questioning that that's true. I'm just telling you, and that I see two things happening at once. Through the agency of people, right? Hashem caused this to happen. That is the basis of what it means. By the way, there's a lot of misunderstanding of this. You will find that, for example, right? Since Purim's coming up, there's a good example. There's a custom on Purim among the Jewish people to wear masks and costumes. And we all know about this. So the real truth is, right? And if you look in the Svarim, they will say that this is because the word Esther means hiding. Anochi haster astir panai bayomahu. I will hide my face from you on that day. Started, the Torah says, was a reference to the holiday of Purim, where the Jews felt like Hashem had hidden his face from them, and then salvation came, and they saw he had always been there, planting the seeds. The queen was a Jew, and everything else. So I've seen people say, that's absurd to say that that's why. Because if you look when masquerade parties became popular in Italy, you'll notice that until then there's never any reference anywhere of a custom for Jews in any part of the world wearing costumes on Purim. And when they got to Italy, and the way people used to celebrate parties was with masks and costumes, then Purim began getting celebrated that way. And from there, it spread. So that's the real truth. Professor Sperber has this in his Minhagei Yisrael. It proves that very, very convincingly. I read that years ago. It was very convincing that historically that's how it got to the Jewish people. So you see, it has nothing to do with Hashem saying, I'll hide my face in that. So I don't understand why these even contradict each other. One of them is telling you how historically this custom got adopted by the Jewish people. And the other one is telling you why. Why did Hashem have history go in such a way where Jews adopted such a practice to become the appropriate way to celebrate the holidays? And I don't have to even say, otherwise, why did the Tzaddikim support it? This is why. Because whatever happens in the world is happening from Hashem. And also, it happens through nature. Also, it happens through history. We believe Hashem is involved in history. He's the God of history. He's the God of... So if somebody hits you in the face, Hashem hits you in the face. Also, that person did. Now, that person is going to pay for that. But if that person wasn't alive and was never born, you still needed this experience. That's a Sefer Chayim. Therefore, Yodeya Hashem derech tzadikim. Hashem knows. He's intimately involved in planning and arranging the ways of the righteous. The things that happen to people, the challenges that face them, are from Hashem. Rav Hirsch says another really interesting thing about the tree that ties into this. He says, all the branches that fell off in the winter from the tree, they were all the weak ones. They were all dead anyway. He says they weren't very vibrant. He says the leaves, those beautiful leaves in the fall, they're dying. That's why they're that color. And when they fell off, they had no future anyway. It was the core, right? It was the core that remained and that was strong. And he says that's what happens in life. People have all kinds of dreams of what their life is going to be, and they get battered by the weather and the winters of life. And he says that's the story of the Jewish people also. It's a tough road It's been a challenging thing, but the stuff that fell off and the stuff that was broken was never really the strongest anyway. It was never really the things that were going to last. Those were temporary things. And when they were already dead, they were broken off. And in order to survive, and in order to make it through, whatever was not necessary stopped getting nutrients from the tree and was broken off. And it will be back, and it will be stronger, and it will resprout. You know, Gemara says, Avodah Zarah, Daf Yud Tes, it has a few pieces on this Gemara. So I mentioned a couple of them already. So it says, Ve'aleyu lo yibol, that its alim, its branches will not wither. So Gemara says, like, what are the branches exactly? For a Torah scholar, Gemara says, that represents his conversations about stuff that is not Torah. Sichat Chulim. Even those are Torah and require study. So, in other words, what are the things that hold on? The purpose is the fruit. So the fruit is the mitzvah. The fruits are the mitzvah, are the good deeds. But what holds them up? What takes care of them? I mean, there's a whole physical world that's necessary to address as well, and that's the branches of the tree. The branches are the alim, and they will be strong, they will be sturdy, and they'll hold the fruits, because even those are done. So the word siach, which means conversation, the sichat chulin, right? The idle conversation, the Gemara says, of a righteous person, even that is infused with wisdom. So siach also has to do with foliage, called siach hasadeh. The Torah says that means the trees of the field. And one of the reasons the Mefarshim say is because siach, which means conversation, when you have trees in the field and the wind blows, so they rustle, and it sort of sounds like conversation. And that's like some of the Mefarshim say that's why it's that way. Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. Famous. It says Yitzchak went out to talk in the field. So the Gemara says Ein sicha el tefillah. He must have been talking to Hashem, and that's where we learn that the prayer of Mincha. Yitzchak went out lasuach basadeh. But if you look at just the Mefarshim there, it says lasuach imreya, but like the Rashbam says he went out to talk to his friends. And another one of the Mefarshim says he went out to look at he went for a nature walk. He went to look at the trees. So there's this like very interesting connection now between this conversation about. Okay, so siach is shin yud ches, sin yud ches, 318. Sin yud ches. There's a story in the Torah with Eliezer. Eliezer is Abraham's servant, and Abraham goes to fight off in the war with the 4 and 5 kings, and he takes with him 318 men. Rashi says that's just Eliezer. Because Eliezer, the gematria of the name Eliezer, Aleph Lamed Yud Ayin Zayin Reish, is 318. And so it was really Eliezer, but he was considered as though he had 318 men. Isn't that interesting? So that Eliezer becomes, Eliezer is the Eved of Abraham. He's the person who is really from the family of Canaan. He's from a family that's very steeped in physicality. And by his relationship with Avraham Avinu, that physicality becomes a loyal and faithful slave to the intellect. And that's the appropriate way. In other words, every one of us has physical side to us, but it should be used in the service of our mind. In other words, a person has the capacity with every part of their gashmis, with every part of your physical, to use that as an unbelievable tool to advance the goals and values of life. Simple example. Gemara says, if a person meets up with a disgusting urge in the street, so they're walking down the street, it's just like the imagery, right? It really means a person has a bad Yetzer Hara, to do something wrong. Mashchehu lebeit midrash. Drag him with you to the Beit Midrash. So it's like, imagine meeting the Yetzer Hara in the street as if it were personified as a person. And he says, would you like to come with me, right, to visit some sort of, right, house of ill repute? So you say, yeah, just 1 second. And you grab him by the arm and against his will, drag him with you to like some Torah class. Yeah, that's the imagery. So here's the question. It says the Vilna Gaon, and I've seen this in multiple, Reb Tzadok of Lublin, the Hasidic Shasvar, it's everywhere. Why not, I would have said, if you run into the Yetzer Hara, flee for your life and take refuge in the Beit Midrash and lock the bolts. I wouldn't say invite the guy in, right? Why would you do that for? Explains the Vilna Gaon and others that exact desire is just as necessary for Kedusha as it is for the bad things. In other words, a person who has a desire, where is it coming from? A person wants to do the wrong thing. There's a loneliness, there's a yearning for connection. There's however we could diagnose what's there, there's a way that that same passionate desire can be used within the context of building a marriage, building a life, building Torah, building one's connection with Hashem. There is nothing, there's zero, there is nothing that you have ever wanted in any way that cannot be reframed, if you really understood it, and then used as a method of seeking Kedusha. There's no such thing. It's only because we limit it. So a person says, no, I need to marry that person. Okay, so that could be stupid. That could be wrong. We know people, right? Everyone knows that people who limit. That's not, what do I really want? I want to be in a loving marriage with somebody that I admire, that I respect, that et cetera, right? A person could clarify that in a way. Sometimes it has nothing to do with merit. Sometimes it's, I need to meet the following needs of my emotional self. And I'm thinking that that's going to do it. But the truth is, if I broaden this and understand what it is, so drag him with you to the Beit Midrash. In other words, there's nothing about Kenan, about even the most physical of characters in the Torah, that if they wouldn't be directed by Avraham, so then Eliezer eventually, the Midrash famously says, he leaves Arur, he leaves the curse, and Lichlal Baruch, and he becomes blessed. In other words, there's nothing in the world that, if directed by Kedusha, cannot be used for holiness. There's nothing. Everything is really there for that reason. And so now the question just becomes, how do we do that? Well, Avraham's relationship with Eliezer is one of these examples, where he's his, essentially, Sichat Chulin, where all the physical stuff, I mean, what value is the branch on a tree? Can you eat it? It doesn't give very much shade. It's basically useless, one specific branch. But the answer is, if it's used in service of producing a beautiful fruit, and then that fruit has seeds in it, so somebody eats the fruit, and the seeds are planted to create more trees, and suddenly this one branch was, I mean, you couldn't possibly have the fruit, or the seeds, or anything else without the branch. The branch itself, though, doesn't provide such a particularly valuable service in and of itself. You can break it off and use it to hit your horse, you know. Is that the big value, right? Like a little thin branch that's holding, but the minute that it's holding mitzvot, the minute that's being used for that, so it becomes extremely holy. You know that this is true, by the way, even with any midah of any kind. There was somebody who said to me recently about a certain personality in the Jewish world who we both know. This person was very frustrated. And I said, this guy is arrogant. So I said, listen, I don't know him well enough to know for sure, but I do know 3 stories about this person. I'm going to tell you one of them, right? Where they stood up and risked their job and essentially their livelihood and even their reputation to be loyal to the values of Torah. And that takes a lot of confidence. That takes a lot of courage. And even something that in many situations, if used incorrectly, is arrogance. And so it seems to me that the way this person is actually living their life, you might call it arrogant. You could. Like, you could say that they have this challenge, but I see them using those exact midot to really further. And you're right, it could be there's some way that they could, when you have that midah, it becomes challenging to always use it only in the exact places. And maybe sometimes it slips over into another conversation or another thing. But as a whole, there's other people that don't have any of that, and they don't stand up. You know, the person who has lo telech rachil ba'amecha. You're not allowed to be a peddler of gossip, the Torah says. Don't run around telling stories. You know what this one said about you? And then it says, lo samad al dam re'echa. Don't stand idly by your brother's blood. So if somebody's being killed, all right, the Torah says, you can't stand by. So, but the first part of the pasuk says, don't peddle gossip. And the second one says, don't stand idly by. So the Sefer Charedim and other svarim say the following basic idea. That if somebody is doing something that could hurt another person, stealing from them, killing them, slandering them, it suddenly becomes completely wrong to say, I'm very careful about Lashon Hara. You have to speak up, or you are, right, you're complicit. And if you don't, then you violated Lo Samad Al and you violated standing idly by someone else's blood. So, in other words, the same capacity, right? Lo telech rachil, this same part of you, that if a person is too meek, somebody walks up to your friend and insults your friend in public, you have to stand up. And you have to say, I remember this conversation years ago, somebody telling me, we lived in Israel, I think it was, and there was someone eating by our house, I maybe from seminary. I think she said something along these lines. She said that, like, she was in the hallway in her seminary, and one girl was really insulting another. And she said, I like shalom. Like, I'm a person who can't live with this kind of drama. Like, I like shalom, so I just, like, didn't say anything and walked. And I remember, like, at the time, okay, so it's very hard in the moment, but, like, that's not shalom. That's lo samad al navayacha, right? That's that's watching somebody be murdered in front of you and not saying anything. What you have to say is, hey, please don't talk to my friend that way. You can't talk to her that way. This is my friend. You have to stand up. Now, where does that courage come from? You understand? Where does that courage come from? The exact same chutzpah, right? The same thing that when they spoke up to a teacher or they spoke up to their parent, it was terrible chutzpah. That exact characteristic is what's necessary to save the lives of people around you when they're being insulted and being hurt. And so it's always a trick to figure out where to use it correctly. But ve'aleyu lo yibol, in other words, the person who is rooted in the truth, the person who is loyal to the values of the Torah, the person who has gotten the message, in other words, what we're saying is that there's a different ways of Torah, and you need to figure out within the authentic, right, ways of Torah, what reflects you? How do you connect and really loyally commit to serving Hashem? How do you do that? So that's hard. And it involves, first of all, learning Torah from more than one person for a start. In other words, realizing that there's different ways and so forth. So what's going to eventually happen is no part of you will be lost. Aleyu lo yibol. No part of you will wither or be lost. Because even the parts of you that would seem to be sichat chulin, just idle conversation, things that are not the Torah, it's not the fruit of the thing. They're used to carry the fruit. They're used in the service of the Avraham, of all the mitzvahs. You know, Avraham is Gematria 248. So the Torah are always saying Avraham represents the 248 positive mitzvahs because positive commandments come out of love, and that's Avraham, right? It's motivation, it's passion. So the 248, which is Avraham, right? And the 318, which is the Eliezer, so Eliezer supports that totally. He's the branch. Aleyu lo yibol. That's the Sichat Chulin. And the Gemara says Eliezer's conversation is recorded in enormous depth. It tells you the whole story. And then it goes back and says the whole story again. Eliezer said, let me tell you the story. I went to the well. And it's like a whole chapter of the Torah. The Torah is so careful. It won't tell you the laws of Shabbat. It gives you one extra letter, and that tells you a whole world of things. And here the Torah goes on and on and on. Because Sichatan shel avdei avot, right? The conversations of slaves of the avot were greater than the Torah of their children. That's a Gemara says. Yafa, it's more beautiful, it's more powerful. In other words, the impact of being able, the idea that an Eliezer, some Canaanite slave, by virtue of his absolute loyalty and commitment, Eved Avraham Anochi, his total commitment to being a vehicle of Avraham Avinu and the mitzvot and the positive things, so Eliezer therefore became totally Torah. And if he just babbled on in conversation, so to speak, it's not babbling anymore. It's real, meaningful Torah, because every bit of that, every single detail becomes as precious. And look, I mean, sometimes a person can have the misunderstanding that I don't know if God really meant any of this for me. I think God will understand when I explain to him that I didn't really have to do this or that mitzvah, or I didn't have to do this. I mean, I hear that from people. Like, I'll work it out with God. I'll explain it to him. It's such a misunderstanding. It's such a misunderstanding. The Torah is exactly built for you. If you don't see it, it's because you don't see yourself. And you're not seeing the Torah. But the Torah is exactly built for you and me. And by rooting ourselves in it, rather than allowing the winds of change, the winds of culture to push us back and forth, because that's what happens to Rishayim. By rooting ourselves sincerely in the Torah and adjusting ourselves to the Torah, so then every single part of our personality, when that's done correctly, will find its perfect manifestation. And I think that this is the number one thing that we can try to give to our children, and anybody who will be influenced by us. The lesson that the purpose of the Torah is not to twist you into some other kind of person, where you give up a lot of happiness and you give up a lot of the things that would really make your life meaningful and happy in order to be loyal to the Torah, and then one day you'll get rewarded after you die. And that's just false. It would be worth it to do that, but that's not what it is. The purpose of the Torah is to make every minute of your life and every aspect of your personality and every single part of you eternal and meaningful and actualized. That's the whole purpose, that you will be happiest in this world if you have a relationship with the Torah and the mitzvahs. And I think that lesson is something that we have to constantly remind ourselves of, and we have to constantly encourage, whether it's verbally or just from... Our children need to know this, that we're not reluctantly, I should probably go to shul so I don't roast in hell. Right? Like, that attitude is really very... You should marry a Jew because otherwise your grandmother will be disappointed. Is a very bad message. You should marry a Jew because, what are you, crazy? I mean, what's the alternative? Like, what would be more wonderful? Right? In other words, like, what would be more wonderful than building a Jewish home filled with Jewish values? The moment that there's anything other than that, as the primary motivation, we're missing out. And I think that's an amazing attitude, perhaps, to go into this Tu B'Shvat, to go into this celebration of the birthday of the trees. That a person is much like a tree, and being solidly rooted in the Torah, with multiple sources of water, right? Where not only the fruit is important, but the branches too. And we look at the chaff and we see that it winds up in the middle of nowhere and it winds up destroyed and it's driven by the wind. And our job is to get to a place where the wind doesn't drive a tree anywhere. It knocks off a branch here and there, which was the dead branches anyway. If it was really strong and it was really solid and it was really there, it would last all the time. And the real tzaddikim, it seems that's how it really winds up going. Eventually they become something like an evergreen, something like a tree where the branches are always there and they make it through the year. And they constantly produce fruit. Be'ito, in their appropriate times, the fruit is always ready to come. V'chol asher yasa yatzlech. Every single thing that you do in your life, every single thing, if you follow this prescription, will be met with success. That is the promise. And hopefully we understand a little more just what that means, and we'll all be on a path to tremendous success in whatever area you're focused on, and even the areas that you're not. Guys, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to the Zakowskis. Thank you for hosting. Such an honor. It's really beautiful. So we thank you. And Nashikah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.